rules, and principles, and keeping them unselfishly, not in hope of enlightenment, but because this was the proper labor of an enlightened human being. Under such conditions, we do know that there were mystics, and great mystics arise among these different groups. But these mystics were persons who had slowly unfolded. They had lived each step of the common life. They had grown skillful and wise in the philosophy of the doctrine. They had gone out and dedicated themselves to the service of others over long periods of time. They had gained practical insight as working with the sick and as helping to solve the problems of the burdened. They had become the counselors of rulers and the friends of princes. They had helped in the creation of good laws. They had helped to perfect arts and sciences. Many of them actually gave skills to their peoples. And Kobodaishi, who was one of the great monks of the Shingon-shu in Japan, is accredited with having given almost as many inventions to the Japanese people as Leonardo da Vinci gave to Europe. A tremendous genius in his own right. He was not a person who had simply decided to be spiritual. He had worked and labored and studied. He had lived with the wives. He made the long and at that time dangerous journey to China in order to come closer to the great seats of the doctrines. He was a master of knowledge, one of the most perfectly informed men of his time, and still regarded as one of the most enlightened men of Asia. These people grew sincerely. They gave everything they had to growth. And they grew not just simply for the sake of being wise themselves, but that they might become the founders of essential and practical movements and organizations. They were great mathematicians, great artists, great musicians, poets, men of literature and letters. And out of the temples and the shrines and the sanctuaries came the great arts, the great modelings and sculpturings, the casting in bronze and in silver. These people were highly skilled. They took the attitude that the more able they became in everyday labor, the more completely they were able to express their spiritual convictions. So that they worked with the law. They became better, realizing that the reward of being better is to know more. The reward of greater daily virtue is enlightenment. That there are really no tricks in this thing at all. By the time they reached the point, as in Zen-shu or in the Shingon-shu or Tendai-shu, where certain esoteric disciplines were recommended or given to them by their teachers, these disciples were so well grounded in every principle of ethics, in their knowledge of the universal structure and the operations of all the laws of nature, that it would be virtually impossible for them to make a mistake. They had all the groundwork in, all the principles thoroughly established. Usually, in Zen, not much of an esoteric nature was divulged under 20 years of discipleship. And that discipleship was more rigorous than anything that we can imagine. It was constant self-analysis, the breaking down of every illusion and delusion in consciousness. And by the time the disciple was ready to go on, he had truly cleaned his own inner life. It was well disciplined and well ordered. People that have this degree of insight can probably be trusted, and you seldom if ever hear anyone in this type of level of activity who ever perverted what he knew or contributed to the corruption of anyone else. These people knew, and they were able to use their knowledge wisely. What we are worried about constantly and stricken about so often is the dabbler, the one who really tries, but simply doesn't even have a comprehension of what he's trying. To him, a few lessons and a couple of books, and he's well on his way to nirvana. It just doesn't operate that way. This does not mean, however, that the individual cannot grow. He can grow continuously. But he has to grow with a dedication, not an enthusiasm alone. He has to grow along the line which is the most difficult of all forms, and that is self-discipline and self-control. I know more people who have tried to be spiritual without taking hold of their own lives. They can do almost anything you can imagine except what they should be doing, and that is controlling and directing their own conduct. These people are perfectly willing to devote a great deal of time to wandering about the cosmos, but they cannot be patient as people. They do not know how. They cannot really be thoughtful. I know many of them that cannot even be commonly courteous. There is no attention to personal character. This is something to be left behind, to be curdled, to be considered fit only for persons of less spiritual insight. There is no spiritual insight apart from character. There is no safe mystical experience apart from character. There is no possibility of man exploring the inner universe of value safely unless his own integrity is completely established. Any other course of procedure is bound to lead ultimately to difficulty. And because no one but the individual himself knows the degree of his insight, each person has to come to some way of judging these things. You cannot tell him that he isn't ready. He will keep on going around until he finds someone else who tells him he is ready. And this goes on because the person wants to believe that he's on the verge of enlightenment. He doesn't want to be told he hasn't started yet. So you can't convince people against their will. And yet, because of this peculiar type of religious thinking that has developed, people just get themselves into trouble and have no way out. And by the time they realize the degree of their trouble, the very persons who got them into the trouble can't do a thing for them. So they wander about, hoping for someone who can perform a miracle and rescue them from the dilemma into which they have gotten themselves. By this time, perhaps they do have a little experience. It will serve them in good stead in due time, but at the moment they're in a very uncomfortable state about the whole thing. So we can only profoundly warn the individual that when he starts dabbling with mysterious things, he must either have the consciousness to handle these things, or he should leave them alone. And no one who is frightened out of his wits by every psychic wind that blows is in a condition to handle the problem. No one who has to seek help is in a condition to handle it. Therefore, if this situation seems to be developing, there can be only one answer. Get out of it as quickly as you possibly can and get your feet back on the ground again. Use the simple ways. Realize that this whole problem of what you might term psychic involvement is only possible at all because, basically, the person is not capable of thinking with true wisdom. He isn't able to really think straight. Somewhere, weaknesses of his own have contributed to the fact that he was deceived, or has deceived himself. It has to start with this. From that point on, all perspective can be lost, and the situation can just be a long, terrible hurt with no really, apparently, satisfactory explanation. But in the beginning, the person had to be foolish. And the only answer is to stop being foolish as quickly as you can. There are ways in which some damage in this area can be rescued, or the individual can be pulled out of his problem. We realize that as the problem gets worse, as the individual advances in some form of psychic persecution, which is more and more difficult for him to get off of his own mind, he is inevitably becoming neurotic. He is becoming fear-ridden. Even if he hasn't reached a degree of hallucination, it may come any moment. He is certainly actually frightened. He is living in fear. The whole thing has become a phobia. And this phobia is nursed. Fear is nursed by fear. The more he worries about his fears, the more he thinks about his fears, the more he waits for new symptoms to appear, the more frightened he will become. And if this goes on, especially if the individual is alone, perhaps living alone, where there is very little contact with other people, too much loneliness to begin with, which may have been a contributing cause in the first place, then this person must either make a valiant break with the situation where he finds himself, or he will not get out of the difficulty. And unfortunately, it is not a difficulty that will cure itself, nor will it get better unless something is done about it. Realizing, therefore, that as in the case of nearly all forms of neurosis, which may come from other causes, there is too much self-attention. The mind and emotions are focused upon the dilemmas of the self constantly. This means that little by little it becomes a 24-hour vigil of psychic self-defense against the unknown. The individual doesn't dare sleep. He doesn't dare do anything because of this constantly increasing pressure of fear. A pressure that is usually accompanied by psychosomatic symptoms that seem so real that there is no way, apparently, of explaining them except to assume that the psychic persecution is real itself. Under this combination, we have a hard, vicious circle, which is extremely difficult to break. The best way that we can solve it is by starting out with the assumption that a pattern is no stronger than its weakest link. The situation is a pattern. If we can break it somewhere, we perhaps can break it everywhere. If we can put new factors into the problem, or take old factors out of it, if we can shift the point of view, if we can change the psychic chemistry in some way, then the individual may be able to handle it himself from there on. So we have common things that we try to do to help people in this type of problem. We try to find out anything that they are doing that is unnatural, unreasonable, or likely to contribute to the trouble. If these people are starving themselves to death in the name of religion, we suggest a square meal, but that it be taken slowly, because otherwise they may have dyspepsia. If these individuals have been practicing some form of syncopated breathing or something of this nature, they must stop it, or the situation will not change. If these people have left the world because it is so materialistic and so unspiritual that it is constantly hurting their very, very subtle etheric bodies, we suggest strongly they go back in the world and reestablish contact. That they've got to get out and get back in those good old low vibrations again, because the high ones are killing them. If these people have no interest in life whatsoever except waiting for the next psychic phenomena, we strongly recommend other interests. And we particularly recommend some form of activity which disciplines. If these people are retired on an income or are divorced and living on alimony and don't have to work, they're in a especially bad spot. These people have to decide that they have to work. They have to come to the conclusion that no matter what they have or how much security they enjoy, they will destroy themselves if they are not usefully occupied. We find then the importance of these people training some part of their natures. And the result shows how badly this training is needed, for so frequently these people are completely unable to take up any line of self-discipline without a massive struggle. These individuals cannot go back to school and take some adult education work. It's too monotonous. In other words, they cannot say to themselves, I expect to do this and I will do it. It's part of the very evidence of the trouble they got into. But you've got to get them out of it. They have to have new interests, new activities, practical outlets. They have to take up studies. They have to discipline themselves. If you want to play the piano, you discipline yourself. If you're suffering from a bad psychological or psychic condition, if you're unable to control these vibrations that may or may not be entities, it is simply because of lack of discipline. If you will discipline yourself somewhere, it will show all over you. Therefore, if we can get this individual who has never made up their own mind clearly on any subject in their entire lives, but who thinks they're just on the suburbs of heaven, if you can get this individual to go out and study music for 5 years, doing scales for the first 3, and insisting that their own hands and their own minds will do this, or if you can get them into a group of Sumi painters and make them learn to make circles and bamboo joints on paper with black ink for 3 years before they're allowed to put a leaf on them, these people get well. Why? Because they have suddenly learned that they can make their minds and emotions do what is required of them. The person becomes positive. He has some accomplishment. He has some ability. It usually takes from 1 to 3 months for a discipline to become a fascinating thing. The first 2 or 3 months, it is drudgery. But if a person really has some qualities within his own nature, he will develop a growing interest in the new things that are of interest or value to him. So if he can hold on for 2 or 3 months, the subjects will probably take over a large part of his habit mechanism. He will then go on and find that he has learned how to learn. If he will do this and gradually develop disciplines, he will then be able to turn these disciplines to the direct problems that are probleming him. He will be able to turn these disciplines to fear. He will find that he is able to control fear in himself. He will be able to control his own spiritual ambitions and realize that he's probably not quite ready for nirvana. He will be able to recognize that it is possible for him to go home into an empty house, perhaps, and build there a world of interesting values because he has become an interesting person. It is from ourselves that the environment in which we live must radiate. If we are negative, the environment is negative and afflicts us. If we are dynamic in ourselves, the environment in which we find our daily living becomes itself a dynamic source of inspiration.
Yeah, so we know that the Ice Age started, the most recent one started 1.5 million years ago, and it just stopped about 10,000 years ago. So that's when it stopped, 10,000 years ago. And the ice receded about 5,000 years ago. And the Europeans entered into history 4,000 years ago. And this is when they first recorded this race called the Europeans 4,000 years ago. That was recorded on a pallet, on a mace head in Africa when they first met the Europeans. That's 4,000 years ago. So this is when they entered history. And of course, they entered history violently. And we say they were violent people. Well, they came from the Ice Age. Now, we're in Europe. We're around France, Germany, Sweden, the Slavic countries. Those areas are known as glaciated. Glaciated soil, when the ice melts, the ice floods the area, and when it floods, it washes away all the vital nutrients. This is what happened. So I'm going to just outline some of them and go over some of them that were washed away from the soil. Selenium. Anyone raised on Ice Age glaciated soil, that's in France, that's in Germany, that's in England, is going to have a selenium deficiency. This is fact. This is what the soil content is. They're going to have a zinc deficiency. They're also going to have a phosphate deficiency. Or phosphorus, excuse me. That's just some of the deficiencies, just from eating plants that are raised on this glaciated soil in Britain, in France, in Sweden, in the European countries. So they're raised on soil that is depleted of these nutrients. When you have a selenium deficiency, you become irritable very easily. Your mind becomes unstable. When you have a zinc deficiency, you lack a neural, it's an element used to transmit nerve messages. So your nerve messages are not transported balancedly, you see, just by having a zinc deficiency. Then when you have a phosphate and potassium deficiency, by the way, this is the soil that raised the plants that they were eating. It was deficient in these nutrients. And when you look up these nutrients in a textbook, you'll find that a person that lacks them is violent, very easily irritated, and suffers from what they call schizophrenia, which is a mind and mood disorder. So the Europeans are raised on what we call glaciated soil. So they are deficient in these nutrients from 5, 4, 10,000 years ago. So they continuously were eating plants that were deficient of these nutrients. And when you're deficient of certain nutrients, each nutrient controls a form of behavior. If I take away your selenium, you will become sterile. Because selenium is highest in concentration in the male system where the testicles is, in the sperm, selenium. So is zinc. That's why long ago they told brothers to eat oysters. They were after the zinc, you see. And that's the highest concentration is in the sperm. The highest concentration of vitamin C is around the semen. That's 8 to 10 times higher than the vitamin C that's in the systemic floating blood system. So these vital nutrients were not in the soil of the Europeans. Therefore, nutritionally, their behavior could only be one of unstable personality, violence, aggression, easily irritated, and then, added on to this deficient soil, we have a pineal gland. I'm going to go to the board again. The pineal gland, that's the one that makes melanin. And when you're deficient, their pineal gland is 60 to 80% non-functional, whereas African people have a 100% functional pineal gland. Pineal gland is a gland that is in the center of your brain, and it makes the brain cell for all the cells in the body. It is the master gland. Without it, nothing happens. Nothing. All they tell us is that the pineal gland makes black. But they do not tell you that without the pineal gland, there's no nucleus to any cell in your body. If your pineal gland is very active and stimulated, you can make yourself darker. The Europeans have used experiments where they put themselves in a glass bubble and just stimulated the pineal gland. Without the sun, it became darker, because they stimulated the pineal gland to make the melanocyte stimulating hormone. So they are deficient in melanin, you see. And without the melanin, you have no balance. You lack spirituality, you see. So we have three major things. We have the melanin deficiency. This is anatomically. I'm not going into social science. We all know about prejudice and all that sort of thing, but we tend to not look at the animal that behaves like a human being. So we have the mineral deficiency, the selenium, the zinc, the phosphorus, potassium, and we have the melanin deficiency. All of this is coming out of the Ice Age, where the soil was depleted of these nutrients. So we have a melanin deficiency. When you have a melanin deficiency, you have something that's called obsessive compulsive behavior. I hope you can understand my writing. A melanin deficiency produces obsessive compulsive behavior. This behavior is the behavior of what you would call an addicted person, someone that has to do things step by step. Because when you're high in melanin, you are creative, you're more intuitive. So you create your own steps. But when you're deficient in melanin, you have to go step by step by step. And that's called addictive behavior. If I were to teach someone with a melanin deficiency how to dance, I better paint the steps by step by step on the floor. That is because they're coming out of a melanin deficiency. And that's obsessive compulsive behavior, which you call racism. So, obsessive compulsive people are inherently inferior. Now, all I've spoken to you about is what is nutritionally going on with the person that we call the Europeans, the Caucasians. What we have been going on in our plight with them is dealing with them socially, and say they do this socially and they do this socially and we don't like this, so we protest and we march and all that sort of thing. But we have not, as I said earlier, looked at them as strictly as they look at another group of people. They go in, they take a scientist, and they examine a group of people, and they call it anthropology. Now we're going in, and we're taking the science of our mind, because the mind means science, to know, and we're looking at them. They come from a glaciated area, selenium deficiency, zinc deficiency, phosphorus deficiency, potassium deficiency. They also come from a melanin deficiency. And what does all of this produce? I repeat, unstable thinking, easily irritated, aggressive behavior, distorts reality. Distortion of reality is known as a psychosis. If I show you the pyramids in Africa, and you say black people are dumb, then you are distorting reality. The thing with a mind that's in this kind of state, in this diseased state, is that it believes first and then it sees. You are used to thinking seeing is believing. If you see the truth, if I show you the pyramids, and I say it sits in the direct center of the landmass, and I say a star passes over it every 50,000 years, and then I show you the calculus in the building, and the geometry in the building, and then I show you the space age, which was invented in Africa when they did astrology, as you call it. That was the opening of the space age. I show you all this evidence, and you say African people are inferior, then you are suffering from a selenium deficiency, a zinc deficiency, a phosphorus deficiency, and a melanin deficiency, because you have distorted reality to inferiority. A group of people who are inferior use their imagination and create an illusion that they are superior. There is nothing in recorded history to document that the Caucasians are superior. Nothing. When you read the book Race and Civilization, you find out that they just stopped cannibalism in 1946 in Germany. You have to realize that I haven't given you the social wolf pack behavior of the Europeans. We haven't gotten into them as a socializing creature. Remembering that our African ancestors, what makes us great is that we founded human relationship. We know how to get along with each other. The black man knows how to get along with the black woman until Europeans introduced him to his distortions. You see, what made us powerful is not the math, not the chemistry. It's human relationship. We know how to get along with each other, our children, and God. It's relationship. We have mastered the science of relationship. But when you suffer from a mineral deficiency such as this, and a melanin deficiency such as this, and you are inferior, you're going to distort reality. And that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with some animals that behave like human beings. So we constantly try to get them to change their minds, to change their behavior with all these wonderful intellectual thoughts about harmony and peace and love and brotherhood and all that sort of thing. But you don't do that to a person who is drunk. You don't give them an intellectual sandwich. You have to treat a person like that. You have to first cleanse their system, get rid of their addiction. You find out that they're deficient in glutamic acid. They have a glutamic acid deficiency. This feeds the brain. Glutamic acid. I don't want to clutter the board too much, although I do need an eraser. Now, I told you about the Ice Age. The most recent one is the 1.5 million years ago, which ended 10,000 years ago, and the ice regressed it 5,000 years ago, and then you had the European enter in history 4,000 years ago. This is the only recorded incident of them in history. The Romans and the Greeks are not Europeans. They are Mediterranean cultures. See, what has happened is a person in some history. They have written themselves into history, and you believe it. They are not from the Roman Empire. They are not from Greece. They never were a part of it. At all. Now, the ice regressed. I'm trying to give you the socionic. Now, when these icebergs are moving, they sound like lightning. they like bolts, and they rock the whole earth. And it's like an earthquake all the time. You walk down the street and the street opens up and swallows you. You see, this is the Ice Age. This is the kind of social environment they were in. Understand me? Now, with all that going on, you have human traps. I know you think that the Europeans are buying us as slaves to work the land, but some of us were sold just for delicacies. Some of us were eaten. They have human traps. They have traps for how to capture children. They have human broth, how to bake a child. These are in their recipe books. Race and Civilization is the name of the book, and if you want to know how Europeans really behave, you read a book called Dirty. Dirt. That's what it's called. Race and Civilization is one book, and the other book is Dirt. That's the title. I can't think of the authors right now. But the behavior is what we're talking about. And when you have this atmosphere where the earth is shaking and rolling under your feet, it can produce a lot of fear in you. And then a food lie, because the land is frozen and the water is frozen, so you have a shortage of food. So you're going from starvation to overeating, starvation to overeating, which we call binging or bulimia. And when you meet people, you transmit the same illness to them. So you got black people that overeat and they go on a diet, which is starvation, and they overeat and they go on a diet. So we're just copying their behavior. See, they don't have to teach us confusion, they are confusion. You see? Nonetheless, we have all this going on, and then we have something that closely resembles that social condition. And the social condition is that of what we call a wolf pack. This wolf pack behavior, in that when a wolf captures his prey, they are together killing the carcass, and then once the carcass is killed, then they start fighting amongst each other. And that's what they always do. Their wolf packs today are called alliances. North American Treaty Alliance, United Nations. These are alliances that they form to attack a caucus, or be that Africa, Somalia, Ethiopia. And once they have attacked it, then they fight amongst each other. This is wolf pack behavior. And the wolf always resorts to juvenile behavior after it captures its prey. It becomes very childish and licks each other and cuddles up and does these very childish behaviors. And sure enough, after they capture their prey, be it African people in prison or sexually, however they want to capture us, or capture us through peace or capture us through war, any tool that they use is to rule and control you. It doesn't matter what the tool is. The tool can work. The tool can be peace. The tool can be religion. Any device they use is going to be used to rule and control you. If they give you money, they use money to rule and control you. 90% of all the millionaires, black millionaires, invest in white people and their businesses, excuse me. So money is just used. You say, all this money black people make. Yes, but they gave it to you. So whoever gave it to you for their benefit. So what they gave you is to rule and control you. So you fight to vote. Now that you vote, and they use voting to rule and control you. Then you fight to get in the classroom. And what do? The miseducation of the Negro. Do I have to go into that?